Serial killers are not abnormal to find throughout American history. From the 1970s until relatively around the early 2000s, serial killers were prominent and in full force across the country. Some are high profile, but others are little known. This case is likely one of the most disturbing of the many that plague the state of California. Two men taking joyrides throughout the day and picking their victims at random for seemingly no reason other than just wanting to hunt what they call the ultimate kill. This is the story of the two men known as the Speed Freak Killers. Loren Joseph Herzog was born on December 8, 1965, and Wesley Howard Shermantine Jr. was born on February 24, 1966. The two grew up in the same town of Linden, California, and even lived on the same street. Their neighborhood didn't have many children living in it, and they both became close quickly, hanging out with each other often. They didn't have many friends growing up, and even when they went to high school and into adulthood, this trend continued. Shermantine's father was a local contractor and real estate developer who was successful and was able to give his son plenty of gifts and money throughout his life. The two were also fans of hunting and fishing, and they spent a lot of time in their childhood exploring the countryside of San Joaquin County. However, it wouldn't take long before things in the county would take a dark turn. In 1982, a 16-year-old girl named Ruth Ann Lemon would disappear from Modesto, California. She had met two men who were both in their 30s on August 19th and decided to meet them later that evening 3 blocks away from her house. She left her apartment at around 8:45 p.m. and told her parents that she was going to a store called Sam's Food City to grab a soda. She did show up at the store, but she quickly left. That would have been the last time she was ever seen alive. The two men who were meant to meet Ruth were extensively questioned by police, but they denied that they had been involved. However, Ruth and a female friend of hers had traveled to the Calaveras County frog jump before she vanished with Herzog, and it is believed that he and Shermantine ultimately had something to do with her disappearance. At some point in 1984, Shermantine and Herzog would graduate from Linden High School, and they stuck by each other afterwards. Herzog and Shermantine would also become avid drug users and were especially fond of methamphetamine. They were known as alcoholics and bullies as well, and the two took up residence in an apartment in Stockton, California. The two would eventually come to be known as the Speed Freak Killers because in almost every situation where they murdered someone, the two had done meth prior. On September 1st, 1984, Herzog and Shermantine drove a truck along Highway 88 in Hope Valley, California, which was several miles south of Lake Tahoe and just west of the Nevada border. The area was relatively remote, and as they drove, they saw a vehicle that was parked on the side of the road. The driver, 41-year-old Henry Lee Howell, had pulled over because he was intoxicated. At that point, Shermantine stopped the truck and got out. Without any warning, he fired a shotgun at Howell, fatally wounding him. 2 months later, on November 27, 1984, Herzog and Shermantine would be out driving on Roberts Island, California, just southwest of Stockton. They passed a parked 1982 Pontiac as they drove. They'd turn around and approach the car, grabbing their shotguns as they exited the truck. Inside the Pontiac were two men, 35-year-old Michael King III and 31-year-old Paul Raymond Kavanaugh. Shermantine would shoot and kill King, who was driving the Pontiac. Shermantine would then drag out Kavanaugh from the passenger side of the car and shoot him at point-blank range. Witnesses had spotted Herzog and Shermantine's red pickup, and police would also find tire tracks at the scene of the crime. On December 11, 1984, a 19-year-old woman named Kimberly Ann Billy would disappear from Stockton. Later on August 29, 1985, 16-year-old Joanne Hobson would also disappear from Stockton. At some point on September 8, 1985, Herzog and Shermantine would meet a woman named Roberta Ray Jones Armtrout, who was known as Robin, at a park in Stockton. The three were supposed to go out drinking together, but instead they headed out to a farm close to Linden, which wasn't far from where Herzog and Shermantine lived. Then Shermantine began to beat Armtrout before assaulting her. Shermantine would then proceed to stab her over a dozen times and dump her body on the bank of Potter Creek. A dove hunter would discover her body, and investigators noted that most of the stab wounds were in the back and chest region. On October 16, 1985, 16-year-old Chevelle Yvonne Wheeler, nicknamed Chevy, would decide to skip school that day and was last seen getting into a red pickup truck outside of Franklin High School in Stockton. She had initially told a friend of hers that she was going with a man named Wes to Valley Springs, California. She also told her friend to inform her father of what she'd done if she didn't return by the end of the school day. She'd apparently appeared hesitant to take the trip. However, she eventually ended up going with this Wes individual and did not return home. Wheeler's friend proceeded to inform her father, and the father would call the police. Shermantine was identified almost immediately as the prime suspect since he was apparently familiar with the Wheeler family and was found to be the owner of a red pickup truck. Shermantine was 19 years old at the time, and he had apparently called the Wheeler household the morning she went missing to confirm the plan to drive to the mountains. When Shermantine was questioned by police, he denied involvement in her disappearance. He also told the Wheeler family that he was innocent and vehemently denied his involvement in her case. Investigators would enter Shermantine's family cabin in San Andreas, California. Upon searching, they found blood and hair evidence, but DNA testing was not yet sophisticated enough to handle the samples, and so it was unknown who they could have belonged to. Although police strongly believed that Shermantine was behind the abduction and possible murder of Wheeler, they simply couldn't find enough evidence to pin him. Wheeler's case would remain unresolved for nearly 14 years. On June 3, 1986, 31-year-old Sylvia Lourdes Stanley would go missing from Modesto, California. She had been released from the Stanislaus County Women's Facility on Oakdale Road that day and had called her family saying that she would find a ride home. She was last seen entering a blue or green truck, and to this day, her case remains unsolved. On October 18, 1988, 18-year-old Gail Marie Marks would accompany her mother to the San Joaquin County Mental Health Department in Stockton and would then walk alone to the DMV to get an identification card. After the DMV, Marks would contact her mother and left a message. She would never be seen again. On September 30, 1993, 47-year-old Philip Cabot Lloyd Martin had forgotten to pick up his daughters from school. However, he would never be seen again after that day. Martin's daughter would tell police that her father had worked with Shermantine. She also told authorities that she believed her father would sometimes do drugs with Shermantine and Herzog, but to this day, Martin's case remains unsolved as well. On May 6, 1998, 32-year-old Tracy Diane Melton would also disappear from Stockton. It is unclear how she went missing or who had killed her, but police were able to find a bone fragment that was positively identified as belonging to Melton in 2011. However, her family was not informed until 2012, and the sheriff's office would apologize for this. It is suspected that Herzog and Shermantine are involved in her homicide. And then, the following disappearance would be the one to crack the case almost entirely open. At some point while living in Stockton, Herzog would start a relationship with a woman named Kim Vanderheiden. Kim's father owned the Linden Inn Bar, which was an establishment that both Herzog and Shermantine were regulars at. The town of Linden itself was quite small, and it was no secret to its residents that Shermantine and Herzog were drug users. On November 14, 1998, Herzog and Shermantine would visit the Linden Inn, and the pair would leave with a woman named Cindy Vanderheiden, Kim's 25-year-old sister. Cindy had been a well-liked young woman who had graduated from Lodi High School and was even a cheerleader at Calaveras High School. She had purchased a new car recently, a two-door Chevy Cavalier, and was staying with her parents until her temporary job became full-time. The last time Cindy was seen alive was November 14th. The following morning, Cindy's father, John Vanderheiden, was driving near Mackville Road on his way to work when he passed by the Clements Glenview Cemetery and noticed Cindy's gold-colored Chevy in the middle of the parking lot. Cindy wasn't near the car, and John and his wife, Teresa, learned that Cindy had also never made it to her job in Stockton. John searched the car and found that her purse and cell phone were still in the car, but her keys were gone. She would be immediately reported missing, and by the next day, over 50 people were searching for her. Within the week, the number had grown and the news spread across the region. Kim, who had been living in Wyoming at the time with her husband and two of her daughters, drove back to California to search for her sister. police would suspect the involvement of both Shermantine and Herzog in the disappearance. Shermantine was still a suspect in Chevy Wheeler's disappearance, and he was a hunter who knew how to survive in the California wilderness well. Shermantine had apparently bragged to his sister about how he and Herzog hunted everything they could, including what they referred to as the ultimate kill. Investigators would later confirm that they'd been referring to humans. Sometime in mid-January 1999, Shermantine's car was repossessed, and the San Joaquin Sheriff's Department would search the vehicle. Inside, they found traces of Cindy's blood. As DNA tests were being confirmed, the Sheriff's Department would focus on Herzog. Herzog would almost immediately provide authorities with details about how Shermantine had shot a hunter that they'd run into while on vacation in northern Utah in 1994. Utah police would confirm that a hunter had been killed, but that the murder was unsolved. Herzog admitted as well that Shermantine had killed Henry Howell, and he also said that Shermantine killed Robin Armtrout. On March 17, 1999, Herzog and Shermantine would finally be arrested and charged with several counts of murder. As for the other victims, each man would be charged for different crimes. In the case of Chevy Wheeler, Shermantine would be charged after having been suspected for well over a decade. However, police were not able to charge Shermantine with Wheeler's murder until police searched a remote cabin that belonged to Shermantine and found blood inside. Upon testing the blood, they discovered that the DNA matched Wheeler. Police believed that for Wheeler and Vanderheiden that Herzog and Shermantine had lured them by promising to provide them with drugs. The trial for Shermantine began on November 22, 2000 in Santa Clara, California. Initially, prosecutors believed that Shermantine was likely responsible for killing as many as 20 people, disposing of their bodies in places like mine shafts, remote hillsides, and buried beneath a trailer park. Shermantine had told relatives and acquaintances for years that he had made people disappear around Stockton. In one instance, Shermantine and a woman had been in a trailer park, and while Shermantine assaulted her, he had allegedly held her ear against the ground of the trailer park and told her that he'd buried people and families in the area, and even more morbidly, he told her to listen to the heartbeats of the people he buried there. During the length of the trial, Shermantine and Herzog each maintained that the other was responsible for the murders. As the trial went on, however, the true nature of the type of person Shermantine would be revealed. Several women would testify against him, saying that he had violently assaulted them. This included a babysitter who was attacked when she stopped to collect money that he owed her. Another woman would explain how he had rear-ended her car, and when she pulled over to exchange insurance information, he kidnapped her at knife point. She managed to jump from his car and get away. Shermantine had also been married at one point, and his estranged wife would explain how he was brutally abusive. FBI officials working on the case uncovered over $40,000 worth of guns from Shermantine's parents' home. The weapons were examined to see if they could be linked to any of the murders that the Speed Freak killers were accused of, including a 1994 murder of a woman in Tuolumne County after her dismembered body was found in a burnt barrel. Shermantine would eventually be convicted after 3 months of trial with 4 counts of murder. He was given the death penalty for his crimes as well. However, during his sentencing, Shermantine claimed that he was innocent and that Herzog was the true criminal. In 2001, Shermantine asked for $20,000 to be given to his 2 sons in exchange for revealing information on the location of Cindy's body. However, no deal would be made. In that same year, Herzog's trial would begin as well. A separate jury from the Shermantine conviction would be placed for the trial. Herzog would eventually be convicted on 3 counts of murder and was convicted on 1 count of being an accessory to a 4th murder. He would be sentenced to 78 years behind bars. In 2002, Herzog would be stabbed by another inmate at the High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California. However, he would survive this attack.
I got kids. One of my kids is missing.
Okay.
I want to get over hand, man. I self-destruct.
In 2004, Herzog's convictions would be thrown out in an appeals court, saying that investigators had coerced him during questioning. A retrial would be ordered, and Herzog was charged with 1 count of murder, related to Cindy's death. A plea deal would be accepted by Herzog where he would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter in relation to Cindy's death and would plead guilty to being an accessory to murder in the deaths of Kavanaugh, King, and Howell, as well as pleading guilty to furnishing meth. He would be sentenced to 14 years behind bars with the possibility of parole. The news deeply upset Vanderheyden's family, who believed that it was unreasonable to have the man that they believed was a party to their daughter's death back out on the street. John Vanderheyden praised the original 2001 conviction and believed that only 14 years was simply cheap for a person's life. Shermantine, while sitting on death row, would send letters to a woman named Joan Shelley, whose 16-year-old daughter, Joanne Hobson, disappeared. In the letter, Shermantine claimed that Herzog was the killer and that Herzog had been on a date with Joanne Hobson and killed her, and that he knew where the body was. Shermantine would also write a letter to the Vanderheyden family offering to testify against Herzog, but he wanted something in return. He wanted the families of the victims to ask the governor to make a deal with him where he would be given a chance to be taken off death row and given immunity from any of his crimes that could be discovered in the future. He also offered to reveal Cindy Vanderheyden's body's location. The families did not agree. As for Herzog, he would eventually be released on parole in 2010 after serving only 11 years behind bars. However, no California county agreed to take Herzog for parole, and the Department of Corrections eventually paroled him in a trailer stationed outside the front gate of the High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California. In February 2010, Shermantine's sister, Barbara, received letters from him identifying the locations of victims in an abandoned well on Flood Road near Linden, California. She gave the letters to the police, who followed up on the lead, but in an interview with the property owner, the owner stated that the wells had been sealed before the victims went missing and no further action was taken. In February 2012, bounty hunter Leonard Padilla would promise to pay Shermantine $30,000 in exchange for information about the location of the bodies. Shermantine proceeded to draw a map and provided information leading police once more to the well he'd mentioned in 2010. Padilla would inform Herzog that Shermantine was planning on revealing the location of a well and 2 other sites where the Speed Freak killers had buried bodies. Up until this point, none of their victims' remains had been found. Herzog, shortly after the news, would take his own life by hanging himself inside his trailer. Police eventually found over 1,000 human bone fragments near the well site. The FBI was asked to assist as well, and they were able to identify the remains from the well on March 30th, 2012 as Kimberly Ann Billy and Joanne Hobson. There was also an additional victim and an unidentified fetus that were found in the well. Following up on Shermantine's letter to Padilla, police would find 2 separate burial sites in Calaveras County, California. Shermantine indicated multiple locations near property that used to be owned by his parents. 2 bodies were found, including the body of Cindy Vanderheyden and an unidentified body. In September 2012, Shermantine would be briefly released from death row into police custody to lead authorities to 4 additional abandoned wells where he claimed more victims could be found. All of the wells were near the town of Linden. He was providing the information on account of Padilla paying him an additional sum of $28,000. In January 2013, police began excavating a well site, and Shermantine declined to speak further with the police. However, the FBI announced just 1 month later that nothing of substance could be found, and other directions from Shermantine eventually proved to be misleading. The search for the bodies has led to significant scrutiny against the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office, with many of the victims' families claiming that the police intentionally interfered with and deliberately hampered the search for other victims of the Speed Freak killers. In 2010, Shermantine wrote a letter to California State Senator Kathleen Galgiani that revealed the locations of the remains of additional victims. She sponsored the use of taxpayer funds to search for the victims and handed the letter to the police. Galgiani claimed that the missing person records related to the Speed Freak killers case had somehow been deleted, hampering any further investigation. In 2014, the mother of a missing woman filed a lawsuit against the San Joaquin Sheriff's Office, alleging that they'd mishandled remains from the Linden well. In 2015, a retired FBI agent corroborated her claims that stated that the police had used a backhoe to dig up remains, thus mangling them to prevent identification so that the absence of certain case files could not be discovered. In 2018, the San Joaquin sheriff-elect would announce a reopening of the Speed Freak Killers case. In 2024, it was announced that Shermantine would likely be moved off of death row after California Governor Gavin Newsom announced plans back in 2019 to move inmates with a death sentence off death row. The news upset the Vanderheiden family, who believed that it was unjust that Shermantine was still alive after killing all those people. Since then, there have been no updates on whether or not he remains on death row. To this day, it is not clear just how many victims there were of the Speed Freak Killers. It is likely that the two could have been responsible for dozens of murders and disappearances in the Stockton area and beyond. It remains one of the most disturbing cases in California history,